Brilliant. Well, thanks very much indeed for having me speak today. I think I feel like saying, and now for something completely different. Certainly will be completely different in terms of the sort of chronological focus, looking much more at the later Middle Ages, sort of from the 13th to the 15th century. But in fact, of course, what I'm talking about, peasant mentalities and perceptions, it has to take a starting point, really, in all the good, excellent, long-standing empirical work that has been done on landscapes, if we're going to avoid, entirely fatuous speculation about what people felt about their surroundings. So we have to very much build, I think, on work that's been done on landscape history, the kind of work that David Hall and Chris Taylor did. And of course, they were both very alert, I guess, often in the background, what people are thinking, why are they transforming or gradually changing, depending on your view, the landscapes around them and the settlements they live in. So we have to think about mentalities to some extent, otherwise we're just talking about hedges and furlongs as if they kind of make themselves, which of course they don't. And really some excellent work's been done on this field. I mean, I suppose it's remained something that Chris Dyer and Paul wrote about. I think it was about 2012, one of the MSRG's own volumes, that looking at perceptions and practices was something that kind of remained largely for the future. I think that's changed a bit in the last decade, not least thanks to some excellent work by MSRG's own Susan Kilby on her peasant perspectives of landscape. And that's a sort of similar, in some ways, a similar venture that I've been engaged on more or less at the same time, really, looking at a different area, which was an area in South Oxfordshire. So, I mean, Susan's work was a kind of local study of 3 settlements in the east of England. And our work, and this was a book that appeared, as you heard, in the pandemic, and that was the timing I wanted, to get people through some difficult times. No, it just took us a long time to write because the project actually finished in 2015, but it finally emerged in 2021. And it was equally a localized view. I think the idea was that place name scholars have done some wonderful work on perceptions in their field, often looking at particular names and their distribution or analysing a category of names across the whole country. And it seems to me it would be also useful to look at one area in very great depth to really understand these names or micro toponyms, particularly sort of field names as they're often called, as well as settlement names and place names, major place names. And so back in 2012, I started this project, which fortunately got Leverhulme funding, and it resulted in this book ultimately many years later. And it took as its focus, rather by coincidence, I worked with the Victoria County History in Oxford, as you heard. It took its focus on a single 100 called Ulm 100, which you probably won't have heard of. It's got Benson in it, which was a royal estate centre. For those who know the sort of mid-Anglo-Saxon royal halls, there seems to have been one there. But most you probably have at least heard of RAF Benson, which is what it's well known for now. But I chose the area for several reasons. It's very well documented, partly because it's near Oxford. Oxford College has bought up a lot of land, so there's good documentation. Some early maps, which I'll come on to. But also, I knew it was kind of on the boundary of the so-called this central province that historical geographers have identified. When we plotted it, we found it absolutely cut right across the boundary of the central province. So that to me seemed useful, that we were going to try and get at perceptions in 2 quite different landscapes. So it's 100, this later Anglo-Saxon administrative unit that incorporates 14 parishes and rather more townships, which I'll talk about a tiny bit more later. Some of these medieval parishes have more than one taxville or township by the 12th, 13th century. And it incorporates places which are in a sort of the clay vale, a sort of landscape that will be familiar to many of you from places, I don't know, across the country, including sort of neighbouring Buckinghamshire. You've got quite early settled here. It's right next to the Thames, and the earliest settled bits include Benson here, where there's early Anglo-Saxon, mid-Anglo-Saxon activity. There's a lot of traffic along the Thames, there's a lot of traffic along the Old Way up to East Anglia. And it seems to be, as Sue was saying, it's a place that's got hardly any woods. It's very early cultivated, very open landscape already by the Anglo-Saxon period. And it contrasts quite sharply. There's a dark line there marking roughly the line of the Scarp. And any of you who've travelled through there, I mean, you might have been down the M40 from Oxford to London. They dynamited the Scarp at the early 1970s, but you drive up this long kind of ramp and you drive through, at the beginning, you drive through the Chiltern Hills, really, inside this almost cliff-like section of the motorway. But it's quite a dramatic landscape change, from the Vale to the hills. And people noticed that at a very, very early period. There's a wonderful charter for a settlement just outside the study area in the Vale. And the land boundaries describe this place as lying by Chiltern eaves, as though the sort of the scarp of the hills were like the eaves of a house. And in later periods, if you look at places that are on the dip slope, so it rises up very steeply here, gradually fades downhill into the London Basin on the far side, southeast of this study area. And some of the parishes on the southeast side in the neighbouring country were divided in terms of their tithing groups based on different villas between those that were above and below the hill. So whole communities were sort of identified as being either above or below the hill. So that seemed interesting to me to try and get at whether perceptions are different in a more nucleated and a more dispersed landscape, because that's what we have here. This is the reconstruction of the landscape in about 1300, so the peak of the high medieval population and arable expansion. And you can see here it is in England. Look, it's just sort of northwest of London. It's between Oxford and Henley-on-Thames, really, this study area. And obviously the Chilterns is part of that long chalk range which extends up into Hertfordshire from the Goring Gap. So it's got a long feature of the southern English landscape. And certainly by this period, I've shown the field strips. It's quite laborious to reconstruct those, as you can imagine, where it was possible to identify them. You can be sure, really, that all the brown area in 1300 in the Vale or almost all of it, there are a few closes in around the villages, was open field. And by then we can say common field, wide common field land with very intensive collaboration going on between farmers, with fairly nucleated settlements. The little settlements are very nucleated, the little hamlets. The bigger settlements are rather elongated. They're long roadside, polyfocal settlements, if you like. But they're much more nucleated than what's going on in the Chilterns. It seems to be a wood pasture area that doesn't attract. It's not one of Hilton's kind of dynamic go-getting wood pasture areas, I didn't think, where there's all these opportunities to go and start industry and so on. The population remains very low, it remains very scattered. There are opportunities in the woodlands, on the commons. There's this one little settlement called Crocker End. It's the Potter's End. So there's a little bit of pottery production that goes on, particularly from about 1300 rather than earlier, it seems. So they're very different farming regimes as well as different landscapes. We've got mainly common field farming in the northwest and mainly farming in severalty in the southeast in fields. There are a few open fields or common fields that are mentioned, very few and very small. And they seem to become less important as time goes on. And there's more probably, well, there's quite a lot of pasture actually in both areas. And it didn't seem to me, others will probably disagree, that transhumance was wildly important. It certainly exists and there are routes to facilitate it between Vale and hills. But actually in the early period, the Anglo-Saxon period, there's a lot of pasture in the Vale that could be used. People are going up and using the drier hill pasture. But it's not the case that the Chilterns has way more pasture than the Vale. It's just these very wet areas remain outside the arable land quite late on. So that's the study area. And today, I mean, we looked at all sorts of different things, really. The study looked at the position of houses, the location of houses in terms of access to social public open spaces. We looked at a lot of archaeology, but today I'm just talking about field names, really. It's probably worth mentioning that I was going to use these terms quite loosely of common or open fields. I can't get away with that now, clearly. But what we did find was that hide farms were quite interesting. These Anglo-Saxon farms exploited by a household, quite big land units. They survive in the Chilterns throughout, and some existing farmhouses are on the site of these hide farms. In the Vale, we could actually see hide farms being swallowed up into the open fields into the 12th, 13th century. So it seemed that there was quite a gradual process going on. These fields had been established, but still they were being added to, and people were maybe moving into the village and abandoning these hide farms quite late on. And that was discoverable really through field names, through the hide field name. And it's field names I'll talk about, as I said, for the rest of the talk. Obviously, people have realised for a long time that field names can be a good way to get at people's perceptions. For all the difficulties, really, of interpreting them, you have to be very careful. You need to have onomastic expertise or advice, and not to get egg on your face about the interpretation of names before you can start to speculate about their meaning for inhabitants. But they're really crucial. If you look at Anglo-Saxon charter boundaries, they often say that the land bounds have been communicated by the ruriculi, by the rural people, by the inhabitants. So from a very early period, lords, kings and lords are relying on inhabitants to tell them the boundaries of these land units. And that's the case later on. This slide shows a place, Cuxham, which many of you will have heard, almost all of you, I'm sure, through Paul Harvey's work on Cuxham and his wonderful editing of the documents there. It's a little tiny parish that sits in the sort of scarp region, so it's quite undulating. It's on that borderland between the Vale and the hills. If you go through the village and you look south, you just see a big hill. So you might have called it something hill if you were some sort of, toff passing through once in their lifetime and just granted the estate or something. But if you actually clamber out to the parish boundary, if you're engaged in farming it day to day, you notice this denu, or Old English denu or Middle English dean, this sort of sinuous or winding valley that cuts through the hill. And I think it's really the people that are out in the fields that notice these features and give them their names in the later as well as the earlier period. And it's a nice example of field names evolving too, because this by 1448 it's called Sims Dean. And thanks to Paul Harvey's meticulous work, we know the Sims family arrived in about 1440. So it's very rapidly given this name relating to a family that's taken on the holding. So they evolve, they're not static, they tell us about changing perceptions as well. And I think the origin and transmission of field names has to be essentially about popular memory and speech, within the village, especially early on. There's a wonderful example in our study area of a Brichtrig's Croft. It's called Brichtrig's Croft in the 15th century. Now we know through surviving documentary evidence that there was a 10th century manorial lessee called Brichtrig. But the only way I guess his name could be remembered locally must have been through oral transmission. Of course, as the medieval period goes on, documents thicken up and their use thickens up locally, and peasants are using documents, maybe reeds or even writing, or certainly using tally sticks, are involved in the production of documents. And that may have affected, I think, the transmission of names. And I'll come back to that in a bit. What is reassuring, at least, is that scribes don't always seem to be sort of outsiders sent in to start with. There's one of the local scribes, and we've got hundreds and hundreds of deeds from the study. So we're very lucky all these little transfers of land are recorded in lots of surviving deeds. One of the scribes was the son of a Cuxham miller. So he's kind of from a peasant village background. And the language in the deeds tends to be sort of Frenchified or Latinified a bit. But nonetheless, the Oxfordshire, the regional dialect is preserved, suggesting that speech patterns are being preserved as the names are said to the scribes. The scribes are not making up the names. So that's good. And it's also good, as I say, that we've got lots of them because this area is incredibly well documented. It's not the Yorkshire Wolds, similar to some of these intermingled strips. And this was an interesting thing, actually, because this is a massive, huge field system that's shared between three manors, three different places, Benson and Ewelme, which are part of this early Anglo-Saxon central place, and Berwick. But what's really interesting is that Berwick is divided in two in the early 11th century, and one bit of it's excluded from this shared field system, which suggests to me that in its medieval form and post-medieval form, it's only created in the 11th century. So I don't know what's going on there. Anyway, we've got riches of maps, and the maps are really crucial at starting to put the names together. Rather than just having a spreadsheet of names, I try to locate them all on the ground as far as possible. And these maps were crucial, with their names, were a crucial starting point to do that, as well as all the deeds and so on. What do we actually find then? What can we say about peasant perceptions? I'm presenting all these maps, very conscious that someone's going to say, but peasants didn't have maps, did they? No, they didn't. And it's just kind of a convenient way, I suppose, of presenting these. I'm very conscious it's not a particularly a peasant eye view. On the other hand, you stand on a hill, it kind of looks a bit like this, I guess. Or I could have presented it all as photographs with names imposed as text on photos. Maybe that would have been better, but this is kind of handy anyway. And actually, as I said, the book covers a very long period. And I think by the 17th century, surveying and mapping are starting to change the way fields are seen, even by local farmers. But I won't really come on to that today. What do these field names, when plotted in the landscape, when thought about, when visited, what do they tell us? Well, you're not going to be surprised to hear that one of the things is that peasants knew their land. They had to survive. So they knew the nooks and crannies, they knew the properties of the soils. So they identify things like in Benson, there's a foul slough. So you're pretty unlucky if you've got that part of the open field, but somebody did. Interesting, it's just a slough in the 13th century, a mire. By the 15th century, it's a foul slough. I don't know if it's from the sort of climate change or just a more expressive documentation. But you've got here, this is Chalgrove, one of the big Vale open field villages. You've got rye land there. And look, it's in the free draining bit. It's in the bit that's very suitable for cultivating rye. But you've got all sorts of interesting names that relate to soil properties. This is a tiny little parish called Easington. And we know that the peasants who trudged out, I've been to this little area here, you trudge out and suddenly you almost fall into this enormous pit, which is about 60 feet across and very, very deep. And lo and behold, the field name here is the close above Chalgrove Field leading from the Marley parts, and that's already in the early 13th century. So it's later called Clay Pit Piece, a bit more boring. But clearly they're digging out marl as a soil improver in this area, very clay soil. Okay, so you're not going to be surprised about that. There are, though, other names which suggest elements of sort of aesthetic appreciation, perhaps. I mean, there are some sort of golden-coloured flowers seem to strike the attention. There's Golder as a settlement name, but they like their marigolds as well, occasionally mentioned in field names, roses. But much more, I guess, these kind of things. We don't get many animals, interesting, in this area featuring as maybe they're not very useful identifiers, permanent identifiers of plots of land, but certainly some land is described as being fair furlong or fine. Seems to find its opposite in sleeper furlong, which maybe is very slow growing cold ground. So there's a peasant's eye view of the productive potential of a fine bed of tilth. There isn't of course any sort of romantic appreciation of the rugged landscape of the Chilterns particularly. But what we do see, what's most interesting, is not perhaps picking out names individually, but relating them to each other and thinking about the way that individual acres are sort of identified in deeds. So what we see there is a very sort of relational kind of naming. I mean, this Vale landscape is very, very open, and particularly in the winter, it's going to be a bit of a sea of mud, really, with not many identifiable features within the open fields. So we do find that land's often identified in terms of roads, as sort of by the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, as sort of fixed markers that people knew. Major roads, like here the road to Oxford, the road to Wallingford in 1270, lots of in Easington. Interesting, the decline of Wallingford seems to be pointed out. It's called Westway by the late 14th century. Wallingford by then had massively declined as an urban centre. That's quite interesting. You get the sort of smaller roads as well. So, you've got land is above or below the Oxford Road, shooting on the Mill Lane or the road to a certain village end, to a Packen Prime Way in the Chilterns, to Dead Man's Lane, which seems to run along Grimm's Ditch. And wonderfully, in a Magdalen College deed from the early 16th century, there is the way used to go a procession on the Rogation days in Nuffield, which is rather lovely. So we actually get a sense of people processing around the parish boundary on the Rogation procession, bashing all those poor little boys' heads against trees to make them remember the route. So it's very relational. A little bit less in the Chilterns. I mean, that's a Chilterns example, but it's kind of hard to see your way around the Chilterns through all the woods, and so the relational naming isn't quite so significant there. But what we see is the use of compass points, which is quite interesting, thinking about outside knowledge. That those compass points have been used in major place names in the Anglo-Saxon period. But in this area, at least, in the hundreds and hundreds of deeds, I found that it's only in really the 1270s that we start to see acres described as being north of a road or north of someone else's land or west. Much more often it's described in relation to who owns the land around. Until that date, and the land market here seems to be getting quite lively by the late 13th century with outsiders buying in land. And I wonder if their lesser knowledge required made use of compass points more helpful. But I think there's a peasant sort of resistance to that kind of naming, because in the major field names, going back to Cooksham again, they like to call the fields, the field against Britwell, the field against Brightwell, the field against Pearton. They're using compass points by the 14th century, but I don't think the preference is for this kind of relational naming, really. So that's a change, and that relates in one way, I think, to outside knowledge. But we're dealing with people, of course, who have a very, across the period, a very, very intimate knowledge of their township, of their parish. So knowing who owns land, who has rights to use particular bits of land is absolutely essential for daily life. And those kind of practices that are regulated by very local custom, I think they also help to build sort of shared experiences and a sense of local identity, which I think is one of the most interesting things we can try and get at. And each community not only marked its boundaries, but of course they talk about them a lot, and other people talk about them. So we've got the fields of Cooksham referred to, the wood of Nettlebed, these resources that are being claimed by particular communities. And they're marking the boundaries by stones or unploughed strips in the Vale, by crosses or banks, wood banks in the Chilterns. And they're setting up crosses. Interesting, there's an iron cross in Brightwell. They're using stone crosses, but also iron metal crosses at crossroads, on greens, but also on parish boundaries. And I think the township or the parish, the hamlet names, having separate names for these little places is reinforcing a sense of identity to the hamlet as well as the larger village that you look to for kind of social life, for the parish church and so on. Like Crocker End, I come back to Crocker End, which seems to be a name actually perhaps given by outsiders, the Potter's End, identifying it from the outside really, from the distinctive occupation of the inhabitants. But the way that groups of people of different status, men and women as well, may have shared resources within settlements, you can start to detect that from field names as well. So Chalgrove has a freeman's common. It's a pasture common that's only used by the free tenants. There's one in Benson that belongs to the half-yard landers, not to anybody else. There are cottagers' ends that we see in the field names. So at the micro scale, we can start to see things. Even like in UL, there's a women's washing place. So we can see these sort of shared spaces. We also see sort of elements of individuation. You know, it's not all happy sharing, but people are claiming land and family names are put onto particular features. More so in the Chilterns, where people are carving out these individual closes in severalty than actually in the Vale. And I was going to go on a lot more about historical names, but I just had a card flashed at me. So I've got 5 minutes left. But I mean, Chris Dyer, I'm sure many of you have already looked at his book on the West Midlands, Peasants Making History, how these sort of historical names build up a sense of village identity. And we see that in this area too. We see, you know, there's wonderful names like the Ruin is referred to in the 15th century in Benson's Open Fields, the Old Fort in the Chilterns, which is a Romano-British fort. And particular sites seem to attract layers of naming. So the 100 meeting site has in the 13th century, it's called the Berrystead, the Burr place. And we know there was an Anglo-Saxon trading site there and possibly Anglo-Saxon buildings that we've uncovered archaeologically. It's then in the 13th century got a hidden stone, the Derny Stan. And then by the 15th century, it's got a standing stone cross. So we can see that particular sites seem to be very redolent of meaning over a long period. But I said earlier, names change. The people come and go, names are forgotten, new names are imposed. And that's why it's interesting too, I think. But also, there's a variation in the rate of name change. And we found that those manors that remain in the hands of perpetual institutions like Merton College at Cooksum, the field names change more slowly than in places that change hands between lots of minor lords. And it seems that maybe documentation, surveying and mapping and the keeping of surveys and maps helps to kind of petrify field names to some extent in certain places more than others. So yeah, I mean, I could go on, but I think this is a good way into thinking about differences in the social character of different landscapes as well as their economic character and their field systems. And I think it's particularly exciting because, you know, peasants don't write. We don't have the text like we have for aristocrats. It's a way in, even if it's very difficult. And there are all sorts of similar resources across Europe. You know, if you in the archives at Zwolle, there are wonderful early 16th century land books for Twente, sort of wood pasture area in the east of the Netherlands that I've had a look at. So it could be expanded, you know, way beyond our shores. But that's all I'll say for now. Thanks very much.